Hi all. Today's topic of discussion is going to be on hemolytic uremic syndrome. This is a topic that has been recently updated as recently as 2019 by Indian Society of Pediatric Nephrology. I've added points from the updates to this lecture, but I strongly suggest that you go ahead and read the original article from IAP Guidelines and Recommendations website. So let's get on to this topic. Without any further ado, I've tried to include as much information as possible in this lecture. So let's get started. So hemolytic uremic syndrome belongs to this umbrella group of disorders which are thrombotic microangiopathy. Basically, vessels are getting thrombosed. Okay, and this is the most common disorder in this umbrella. The classical triad of a hemolytic uremic syndrome is microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, thrombocytopenia, and renal insufficiency. Two cell lines from hematological system and one from kidney. And this is of two types. Again, HUS is of two types. One is typical and atypical. The importance is a hemolytic uremic syndrome child with acute kidney injury may require dialysis, and few of them can go on to have a chronic kidney disease, and hence it is important for us to recognize this disorder early so as to prevent further morbidity. What is the diagnostic criteria? Diagnostic criteria is the same as triad. Only thing is you have added numbers and percentages to it. So what was the first criteria? It was microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. So there is anemia, correct? So hemoglobin less than 10 gram per deciliter or hematocrit less than 30%. See, if you cannot remember one or the other, does not matter. Alright, hematocrit will always be 3 times that of hemoglobin in normal concentration conditions. Okay. Next is hemolytic. So how do you know it is hemolysis which is causing this anemia? You can look for fragmented RBCs. Fragmented RBCs are called as cystocytes, and if the percentage is more than 2%, another indirect evidence of hemolysis will be your elevated lactate dehydrogenase of more than 450 international units per liter or decrease in haptoglobin. Why is haptoglobin reduced? See, whenever RBC gets lysed, hemoglobin comes out, correct? So whatever hemoglobin is there, it will try to bind to haptoglobin, and if that is getting saturated, then hemopexin. If that is also getting saturated, then you get free hemoglobin in blood, hemoglobinemia. Understood? So if haptoglobins are getting occupied by this hemoglobin, then the free haptoglobin levels will automatically come down. Hence, that is a evidence of hemolysis which is happening. Okay, so you have evidence of hemolysis, you have evidence of anemia. Next is thrombocytopenia. Thrombocytopenia is the same as definition for any other thrombocytopenia less than 1.5 lakhs. Acute kidney injury more than 50% over the baseline. Okay, suppose the patient has a baseline creatinine of 0.3 milligram per deciliter. If the increase is 50% over this 0.3 milligram per deciliter, then you consider it as significant. Okay. Some of the disorders will be close mimics. You can even put them in your differential diagnosis part. Okay, but I think it is important to discuss it here itself, because all of these will have the triad of anemia, thrombocytopenia and acute kidney injury. May not always be microangiopathic, but yes. So how do you differentiate them? TTP is thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura. Okay, here there will be thrombocytopenia, but it will be severe and persistent, less than 30,000. And the acute kidney injury will not be so pronounced, and neurological manifestations may be more pronounced. DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulation, where all the coagulants, anticoagulants are getting consumed. So as a result, you will have a drop in fibrinogen and increase in prothrombin time, activated partial thromboplastin time, FDP, fibrinogen degradation products, and D-dimer. But the haptoglobin will be normal, because it is not a hemolysis per se, it is more of a hemorrhage that might happen in a DIC rather than a hemolysis. Infection wise, it can mimic that of a HUS or it can trigger a hemolytic uremic syndrome. But it is important for us to rule these out as underlying causes because you can treat these disorders basically, correct? Malaria, leptospira, dengue, rickettsia, H1N1, all of them are either treatable directly or at least supportive care management can be given if identified early. Having said that, not all HUS will have this typical classical triad of hemolytic anemia, thrombocytopenia and AKI. Some of them may have an indolent presentation, very calm sort of presentation. There will be just acute kidney injury and hypertension. And thrombotic microangiopathy, you will not be able to make out clinically. Only histopathological wise you will be able to make out. No anemia, no thrombocytopenia. So you need to have a high suspicion in these patients, and if in doubt, this will be one of the indications for renal biopsy. Okay, so we will discuss about that more later on. So how they have classified HUS is this. Okay, so you have this triad of presentation. So you think of HUS first, and meanwhile you rule out the DDs that we discussed recently. Okay, if TTP is one of the differential diagnoses, store the blood at -20 to -70 degrees Celsius, so that if HUS is inconclusive, at least you can test the blood for ADAM-TS13. So HUS, again, if it is classical, fine, but other non-classical presentations will be cobalamin C deficiency. Shiga toxin associated is the classical one, where the child initially has a bloody dysentery, then goes on to have these findings. It can be secondary HUS, it can be secondary to medications, it can be secondary to malignancy, it can be secondary to transplant, it can be secondary to any vascular disorders, or an infection associated or infection triggered HUS. If none of these are there, then consider atypical HUS. Okay. Also, in conditions where there is a positive family history of similar presentation, recurrent similar illness and insidious onset, atypical HUS should be thought of, and the importance here is the treatment varies. Okay, whereas your typical HUS, the main modality of management is supportive. In atypical HUS, eculizumab and plasma exchange takes a major role. So we will discuss about that later. So that's about the classification of HUS. What about etiology? What triggers a HUS? Why will a person who's normal suddenly go on to have these sort of presentations? So one is STEC HUS. STEC is Shiga toxin Escherichia coli. Okay, E. coli. This is the most common thing worldwide, but in India this is coming down. Shiga toxin is also coming down. Shiga like toxin is also coming down. Okay, O157H7 and O104H4. So how does this present? This you will suspect if the child is having bloody diarrhea or a non-bloody diarrhea, fever, abdominal pain, yes, patient is okay or ongoing for 5 to 7 days, and later child starts having sudden onset of pallor, sudden onset of thrombocytopenia, then you suspect hemolytic uremic syndrome. Okay, within 2 weeks usually it happens. You will try to demonstrate the presence of Shiga toxin E. coli or Shiga like toxin. It can be done by means of stool culture sensitivity, virulence genes. The virulence genes are STX1, STX2 and EAE gene. Fecal Shiga toxin or IgM to specific lipopolysaccharide can be demonstrated, and PCR is the most sensitive, which is done in stool culture. Okay, so you basically try to demonstrate this is the reason for this hemolytic uremic syndrome, because why? Again, your management varies. The important point here is isolation is difficult after 70 days of illness onset and especially following antibiotic. But most of the patients present after this antibiotic or after this 7 to 10 days of illness. Correct? So your type of testing will differ depending upon what age or what stage of disease the child presents to you in. 5 to 10% of sporadic cases and 20% during outbreak bloody diarrhea can turn into HUS, and you need to be on watch. What are the risk factors for a child to develop a HUS? not all dysenteries go on to develop HUS, correct? If the child is younger, if their diarrhea is more than 3 days in duration, if there is blood in stools, and if there is leukocytosis, there is increased chances of the child going on to have a HUS. Just HUS, I am not talking about the severity of HUS, just HUS following a diarrhea. And all HUS may not be preceded by a dysentery. It may just be a diarrhea without blood. In fact, 30 to 40% of Shiga toxin enteric E. coli HUS may not have dysentery. Okay. So, this still remains the most common cause worldwide. Okay. So, STEC and non-STEC will be your Shigella dysentery. Secondary to systemic infections. Yes, systemic infections, HIV, influenza should definitely be kept in mind. Okay. Neuraminidase producing Streptococcus pneumonia. This is something that we need to talk about. Okay. This usually happens in less than 2 years of age. See, your Shiga toxin induced HUS or your D plus HUS, classically what happens, there is a diarrhea, 5 to 7 days of illness, following which the child develops. Usually by the time child develops HUS, all this diarrhea will be settled already or settling down. Whereas here, a pneumococcus pneumonia or a streptococcus pneumonia, whichever way you want to call it, the child will be sick. Child can have septicemic picture, a pneumonia picture, a meningitis picture, but it's a sick child who presents with HUS like symptoms, but it is not DIC. It's important for you to rule out DIC because again it's a close mimic. The difference in the hemolytic anemia that happens is, in a D plus HUS, it's a non-immune hemolytic anemia. So, DCT will be negative. Whereas, in a neuraminidase producing HUS, DCT will be positive. Okay, I will discuss the reason down. To put it simply, the neuraminidase will unmask an antigen on the RBC, and that unmasked antigen will be attacked by our antibodies, making it a immune hemolytic anemia. Okay. So, you need to confirm the diagnosis with a culture sensitivity or antigen detection, and you should treat the pneumococcus pneumonia. So, if you have ruled out everything else, including drug induced, your malignancy and all that, what is left out is your atypical HUS, especially due to complement dysregulation. Broadly, you can classify into factor H antibody present or factor H antibody absent. Okay, so if anti-complement factor H antibody is present, the management varies, whereas for others the management is different. That's why you broadly classify it like that. In atypical HUS, there is no diarrhea prodrome. It's usually indolent, unremitting, or a relapsing type. Multiple factors deficiency can be present. H and I are the most important. Okay. The anti-complement factor H antibody, 50% of weight. I have made a small mistake here. It is not anti-complement factor H. You can just put it as factor H antibody. Wait, now I am also confused. Let me clarify it in the description box. Okay, I am slightly hypoglycemic, forgive me for that, but note that compared to Western world, India generally has not much of autoimmune so-called disorders, especially in children, but now it is on the increase, and especially as far as your HUS is concerned, 50% of atypical HUS in India has anti-factor H antibody. Okay. So, this is important for us to know, and it is important for us to diagnose it. If you screen for this antibody prior to initiation of treatment, you will have to add on immunosuppressive therapy for factor H antibody. So, forgive me, I will clarify whether this factor H antibody and anti-complement factor H antibody are one and the same. Okay. Alright. Drug induced, important for you to remember, is cyclosporin and tacrolimus. Systemic disease associated SLE, transplant associated, whatever transplant you can remember you can put. There is one other variety, cobalamin deficiency induced HUS. Weird, isn't it so? But it actually accounts for nearly 6 to 8% of HUS, and it's definitely treatable. the child will present more like a global developmental delay, seizures, feeding problem, and megaloblastic anemia. You should suspect it if the child has HUS like features by screening for raised homocysteine levels, and you can confirm by genetics, you can confirm by the actual cobalamin deficiency, and you treat with hydroxycobalamin, oral betaine, and folate. So these are all the causes. So causes are your diarrhea associated HUS. In non-diarrheal systemic infections, give importance to neuraminidase streptococcus pneumonia, HIV influenza. Then your drug induced, your systemic disease associated, transplant associated, and if nothing is there, then it is atypical HUS, or you can remember this classification. Alright, you saw so many causes, but why are these causes resulting in a microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, a thrombocytopenia, or an acute kidney injury? The basis for all of them is microvascular injury with endothelial damage. See, normally what happens in an endothelial damage? If endothelium is exposed, this is normal endothelium, so the platelets just run on in circulation, nothing gets adhered. Suppose this endothelium is disrupted due to some reason, then the platelets adhere to the underlying factor, correct? So that's what happens. It promotes platelet aggregation, thrombus formation, and when a RBC is trying to pass through this vessel which is riddled with this thrombus, it has mechanical injury resulting in hemolysis. So this is a mechanical hemolysis, right? It's a non-immune hemolysis. That is why generally a HUS secondary to D plus or a enterotoxigenic E. coli or a Shiga-like toxin is DCT negative. And for platelet aggregation, what do you need? Platelets. So platelets are consumed. So when you try to do a peripheral smear or a CBC for looking for platelet count, you will have a thrombocytopenia. But what is causing this microvascular injury or endothelial damage is this Shiga or Shiga-like toxin, which gets absorbed from the colon into circulation. And why this AKI? Kidney also has vessels, right? Almost all organs have vessels, to be very specific. That's why you can have systemic manifestations also. You can have cardiac manifestation, you can have central nervous system manifestation. So this endothelial damage will result in microthrombi, resulting in acute kidney injury. What about pneumococci producing neuraminidase? This neuraminidase will cleave the sialic acid on RBC. This results in exposure of an antigen called as Thomson-Frieden-Rich antigen. This is supposed to be hidden. Okay, so a hidden antigen is generally never exposed to our antibodies, and our antibodies are also not educated in the course of hidden antigens. So when this gets exposed, this is recognized as foreign antigen and our antibodies start destroying it. If our antibodies are destroying our RBCs, then it is a immune hemolysis, hence DCT is positive, correct? Alright. Next, inherited. See, inherited conditions usually predispose and not by themselves produce a HUS presentation. By predispose, I mean usually some infection will happen, some endothelial damage can happen and it heals on its own. But here, if there is an inherited condition, say factor H is deficient or factor H has antibodies, what happens? Factor H normally suppresses the complement amplification, complement cascade amplification. If this is absent, then the complement cascade is going to go on increasing. Or in an ADAM TS13 deficiency, 1 millibrand factor multimer goes increasing. If this increases, platelet aggregation increases. So even a small endothelial injury will not be able to resolve itself, resulting in a thrombotic microangiopathy and HUS like presentation. Okay. Next, clinical presentation. I think we discussed clinical presentation. To go over it quickly, D plus or diarrhea will have a bloody or non-bloody stools, fever, abdominal pain, vomiting, 5 to 7 days later or usually less than 2 weeks, sudden onset. Okay, this is very important. So it's a sudden onset presentation of pallor, lethargy and oliguria. Oliguria, again, it is important for us as clinicians to differentiate it from the dehydration secondary to loose stools causing oliguria or a renal injury causing oliguria. Okay. Anyways, fluid management is very important in a D plus HUS. D minus HUS, child will be sick if the patient is having pneumococcal sepsis along with HUS, but DCT signs will be negative. DIC signs will be negative, but the hemolysis will be a DCT positive hemolysis. Genetic cause or infection triggered can be insidious. Okay. Spectrum of presentation of HUS usually mild. Most of them are mild. Severe presentations can involve acute kidney injury requiring 50% of them requiring dialysis for 2 weeks. CCF presentation can be there. The CCF can be secondary to a severe anemia or acute kidney injury resulting hypertension resulting in cardiac failure or a volume overload. Where will volume overload happen? A child coming to you with diarrhea with dehydration, if the percentage of dehydration is not assessed properly, child can be overloaded with fluid, again resulting in CCF. CNS manifestations, less than 20% have them in the form of seizures and encephalopathy. So, what predicts children going on to have these 3 severe manifestations? If WBC count is high, if the initial enteritis is very severe, hyponatremia and antibiotic use predict them having a severe HUS. Alright, now the child has presented, child has mild or moderate or severe sort of presentation. You have done your peripheral smear, you have done your CBC count, you have done your renal parameters and you saw it is HUS. Now, is there a role for renal biopsy? Generally, no. Okay, HUS is a clinical diagnosis and a simple laboratory diagnosis. It does not require renal biopsy. When do you go ahead and do a renal biopsy is only in these 3 conditions where the diagnosis is not clear. If it is secondary to some systemic disorder or it's a subclinical presentation with just AKI and hypertension without your anemia or thrombocytopenia, or the clinical response is unsatisfactory, or a patient with atypical HUS has undergone a allograft transplant and the allograft is dysfunctioning. You do not know if it is due to allograft rejection sort of problem or the HUS is actually coming back to attack this graft. So, to rule out recurrent HUS, you will do a renal biopsy in a atypical HUS patient who has undergone a transplant. 3 conditions: unclear diagnosis, unsatisfactory response, or unable to differentiate between a recurrent HUS or something else in a allograft patient. Now, we have done everything, correct? What is the prognosis for a child? Even before you start treatment, this is what the parents are going to ask you. Okay. In a D plus, the prognosis is very good. Less than 5% have mortality. Okay. If we will finish off D plus HUS. Less than 5% have mortality. During acute phase of illness, 50% may require dialysis and they usually recover. And only 5% of them go on to have or require permanent dialysis, and up to 30% can go on to have CKD, chronic kidney disease. Whom do you follow up? Any patient who has hypertension, any patient who had a proper acute kidney injury criteria satisfied, and residual urinary abnormalities more than 1 year after presentation, you need to follow them up to look for CKD. What about pneumococcal HUS? This has got a poorer prognosis. 20% can have mortality and more than 80% will require dialysis. Familial and genetic forms have poor prognosis and they need to be on therapy for a long time. How do you know a patient is recovering? Okay. See, you start treatment with supportive or specific treatment. The first thing to recover, usually 5 to 8 days is the median duration of recovery, or median, how to tell, time of onset of recovery. Yeah. So, first to recover will be your platelets, and 5 days later your kidney injury, your kidneys will recover, and third last will be your anemia. This is again the triad, only in a different order. Okay, platelet, kidneys and anemia. This is the order of recovery. Your management for a D plus or a typical HUS is supportive care, supportive care, supportive care. Fluids, it is important to give enough fluid resuscitation during early stages of a bloody diarrhea. This is very important. Okay, dehydration is associated with poor outcome. So you should give adequate fluid resuscitation but not overload the patient with fluids. Electrolytes has to be closely monitored because acute kidney injury can develop suddenly and patient can go for hyperkalemia and complications. BP control again is important because uncontrolled hypertension can lead to CCF. Early recognition of acute kidney injury is important because you need to institute dialysis, and during acute phase 50% of them may require dialysis. RBC transfusion will be required again in nearly 40% of patients because it's a brisk hemolysis, and the important point here to note is in a pneumococcal HUS you need to use washed RBCs so that you remove as much as plasma as possible, because the patient's RBCs are having exposed T antigen, isn't it? So your Thomson, Fried and Rich antigen. You don't want the antibodies from the plasma also to come and attack these RBCs, correct? So use washed RBCs. Antibiotics for dysentery during the dysentery period, okay, not during the HUS period. That is very important, because if you give during the HUS period there will be more toxin release, and more toxin release will result in worsening of the pathogenesis, that is the pathogenesis, isn't it? So Shiga toxin causing endothelial damage. Whereas for pneumococcus you definitely give antibiotics, yes. No platelet transfusion, because one, even though thrombocytopenia can be severe, it is generally not associated with significant bleeds, and two, whatever platelet you give will get consumed and it will result in theoretical worsening of the pathogenesis. So there is no need for platelet transfusion in a child with typical hemolytic uremic syndrome. What about plasmapheresis? Plasmapheresis or PLEX, plasma exchange therapy, okay, depends on whether the patient is anti-FH antibody present or anti-FH antibody negative, okay. Both of them will require your plasmapheresis, yes. Generally atypical, will put it like that, yes. A typical HUS or a D plus HUS with severe manifestations or life threatening manifestations in the form of CNS CVS manifestation, 1. 2. Atypical HUS. These are the two conditions where plasma therapy, plasma exchange helps. Plasma therapy is not the same as plasmapheresis, okay. It's contraindicated in pneumococcal HUS and it is of limited therapy or limited usefulness in a typical HUS without life threatening manifestations, infection associated or genetic disorder, okay. You need to give daily plasmapheresis till remission happens. What is remission? Remission is when platelet count is more than 1 lakh, cystocytes is less than 2% and LDH is less than 2 times less than the upper limit of normal for 2 consecutive days. So remission is platelet more than 1 lakh, cystocytes less than 2% and lactate dehydrogenase for 2 consecutive days is less than the upper limit of normal, okay. You give plasma exchange therapy daily till this remission happens, then taper over 4 to 6 weeks. Role of eculizumab. Eculizumab is anti-C5 antibody. It basically prevents complement cascade which is implicated in the pathogenesis of atypical HUS, okay. So indication is what? Atypical HUS, correct. The important point here to note is if you are instituting eculizumab therapy, you should give meningococcal vaccine. Why? Because meningococcal infection is common in late complement deficiency. Here you are actually inducing a late complement deficiency by giving or stopping the complement cascade to not proceed after this C5 step, isn't it so? So you need to give meningococcal vaccine prior to eculizumab depending upon the patient's vaccination status. Anti-FH antibody, yes, I will discuss this down below. So in a atypical HUS you can classify it like this, without your FH antibody and with FH antibody. The treatment of choice is eculizumab. The ideal one is eculizumab, but the thing is eculizumab is not available in India, okay, and it's very difficult to procure eculizumab for treatment. So treatment of choice here or first line of treatment is plasma exchange. It is not the same as plasma therapy. So you give plasma exchange daily till remission and then you taper it over 4 to 6 weeks. Do you try to give eculizumab in certain situations? Yes. 4 conditions. One is where there is a lack of remission despite 7 to 10 days of daily plasma exchange, life-threatening manifestations of CNS and cardia, complications due to plex or vascular access happening, or if there is an inherited defect in complement regulation. So, in these 4 conditions, it is rather better to give eculizumab rather than continue with your plasma exchange therapy. If antibody is present, you give plasma exchange along with immunosuppressive therapy. This is important. Immunosuppressive therapy with prednisolone you will give 1 mg per kg per day for 4 weeks, then alternate day over 4 weeks, then taper it slowly. Okay, taper it over 4 to 6 weeks. Along with cyclophosphamide. Cyclophosphamide is 500 milligram per meter square, IV, 5 doses. Yeah. You will give plasma exchange therapy similar to that, only thing tapering will be slightly smaller duration over 3 to 5 weeks, and enable eculizumab for the same indications as without antibody. I think this is all about HUS. We have covered from top to bottom prognosis, complications, pathogenesis and all that. If you have any doubts, please let me know. If you want any clarifications, let me know. I will try to link the IAP recommendations link down below. Thank you for listening to me patiently. I know this was a longer lecture than we usually have, but I think this is a very important topic for us to discuss. Yeah, OSCE questions. Before I forget, I will just add on the OSCE questions. OSCE questions, what can they ask you? See, one, what they can ask is a typical presentation. Okay. Dysentery, 1 week later child presents with anemia, thrombocytopenia and acute kidney injury. So, what is the diagnosis? What is the investigation? What will you be finding in peripheral smear? Peripheral smear schistocytes. Above how much percentage is it significant? More than 2% it is significant. So, that can be asked. And they can ask you indications for renal biopsy. Okay, so renal biopsy is unclear diagnosis, unsatisfactory response, or unable to differentiate a recurrent HUS in a graft. Allograft patient with atypical HUS. So, that is when you do a renal biopsy. That can be asked. Atypical presentation can be asked. Suppose they say everything is normal, okay, and the child is having a complement antibody, then what is your treatment of choice? If treatment of choice, it is eculizumab. If it is in India, it is plasma exchange therapy. And if it is FH positive, then you add on immunosuppressive therapy also. Immunosuppressive therapy, yes, immunosuppressive therapy can be added. They can ask you a pneumococcal HUS presentation, okay, because that is classical. A child who is having a patch on the lungs is becoming sick and with shock. This child is developing acute kidney injury and DCT positive hemolytic anemia. So, what will you think of? How will you manage this child? I think these are the possible questions for your OSCE. They can give you a peripheral smear of a schistocyte. Schistocyte, you will have something like this. All different shapes will be present. Okay, all different shapes of RBCs will be present. You will not be able to make out much of thrombocytes at all in the peripheral smear. So, that is one other way they can frame this question. I think that's all. OSCE also we have covered. So, thank you guys. Subscribe if you have not already done. If you have already done, then thanks a lot. Share it among your colleagues. We can all learn pediatrics together. I am also learning along with you. Bye bye. Take care and all the best.